What if the earliest Christian voice you were never meant to hear belonged to a woman? Not just any woman, but Mary Magdalene, confidant witness teacher. Her words survived only in fragments hidden for centuries in the sands of Egypt. A gospel that dares to challenge the power of the apostles, that whispers a vision unlike any found in the Bible you know. And yet, it was silenced. Buried not by accident, but by intention. Why? Because sometimes history isn't written by the victors, it's edited by them. The heat of that question lingers, but now we slow our pace. The world beyond the headlines is quieter, older, and far stranger than we imagine. We'll take our time here tracing the faint outlines of a voice once nearly erased and listening for what it still has to say. You picture it first as dust, slow, warm, and weightless. It rises from the ground when the wind shifts, carrying with it the faint smell of ancient papyrus and the ghost of ink long faded. Somewhere in this imagined landscape, a hand brushes across brittle fibers, and for the first time in centuries, light touches the words again. Not the measured cadence of the Gospels you grew up with, but something leaner, stranger, more urgent. A voice speaking of visions of fear and courage of a woman standing before men who doubt her and not flinching. The idea that such a thing could exist feels almost impossible. Mary Magdalene, in most imaginations, is already a footnote, a repentant sinner, a silent presence at the foot of the cross. But here she speaks, she teaches, she corrects. And the men in these surviving pages do not always like what they hear. The fragments themselves were found far from the grand marble halls of the Vatican or the clean, climate-controlled vaults of modern museums. They surfaced in places where the sand is patient and the air tastes of centuries. Part of a Coptic codex, weathered yet defiant, it slipped through time's grasp to reach us at all. But its survival raises questions as sharp as any sword. Why was this gospel left out of the canon? Why did its author or its community place such weight on Mary's authority? And why does it still provoke discomfort now, nearly 2 millennia later? It's tempting to believe that history is a straight line, that the texts we have today are the natural, inevitable survivors of an open and fair debate. But history is not a democracy. It's a power struggle. And in that struggle, some voices are lifted high, while others are gently or forcefully buried. This gospel is not complete. Whole portions are missing, and the gaps speak almost as loudly as the words we can still read. Scholars argue over what might have filled them: theological insight, controversial claims, or perhaps something so ordinary it would disappoint us entirely. But between the lines, you feel the pulse of something personal, a human voice straining to be heard. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And so we begin standing at the threshold of a story, both impossibly old and startlingly new, holding in our hands the first fragile pieces of a puzzle that someone long ago hoped we would never solve. Somewhere deep in the dust, the rest of her voice is still waiting. The desert is quiet in a way that feels deliberate, as if it is listening. The air is dry enough to drink the moisture from your breath, and the sun turns every grain of sand into a shard of light. Somewhere between the emptiness of horizon and the weight of the earth below, something ancient is sleeping. It is not a secret hidden behind locked doors or guarded by soldiers. It is buried in the plainest of vaults, the soil itself. And like so many treasures of the past, it waits for chance more than design to be uncovered. It was in Egypt in the late 19th century when fragments of a codex began to surface, though no one knew yet what they had. The story of their emergence is tangled half archaeology, half accident. Villagers digging for fertilizer in ancient mounds stumbled upon papyri that crumbled at the touch, some disappearing into the hands of traders before anyone could read them. That was the way of the desert's archives the earth might give, but it never gave gently. Among these scattered leaves was something that did not match the familiar scriptures, something bearing the name of a woman written in the flowing Coptic hand. The Gospel according to Mary. The fact of its survival at all is astonishing. Papyrus is a fragile thing vulnerable to damp insects and human indifference. And yet the climate of the desert, with its relentless aridity, had wrapped these words in a kind of slow-motion preservation. Even so, when scholars finally examined the fragments, they found a text incomplete with whole sections missing. Pages at the beginning, pages in the middle gone. What remained was enough to intrigue, but not enough to satisfy. An obscure but telling detail emerged in those early studies. The codex that contained Mary's Gospel also carried other works associated with what the Church later called Gnostic thought, texts that spoke of hidden knowledge, of inner revelation, of a faith less concerned with rules and more with direct experience of the divine. To a modern reader, this association might seem academic, a mere curiosity of compilation. But to those shaping Christianity's earliest boundaries, it would have been a warning flag. The scholarly debate ignited quickly. Some argued the manuscript was a late invention, borrowing Mary's name to lend authority. Others suggested it was genuinely ancient, perhaps even rooted in first-century oral traditions. Radiocarbon dating and linguistic analysis placed the surviving copy in the 5th century, but that told us nothing about when its content was first composed. The range of estimates from the early 2nd century to much later remains a quiet point of contention in academic circles. There was something else too, a thread that would wind its way back into the conversation many times. Among the damaged lines, there are moments where the surviving words are unusually vivid, almost defiant. They depict Mary stepping forward to speak when others fall silent, answering questions about the nature of the soul and recounting a vision that even the male disciples cannot claim to have seen. These flashes of authority are not hidden between the lines. They are in plain sight. And yet for centuries, they were locked away in sand, absent from every pulpit and Sunday reading. You can almost imagine the first modern scholar leaning over those faded characters in a dimly lit study, tracing the letters, with their eyes realizing what they were seeing. The ink may have faded, the papyrus may have cracked, but the voice on the page, her voice still carried through. Not a whisper, not quite a shout, but something steady, unhurried, as if it knew it would be heard eventually. And so the question begins to form: was this gospel lost by accident, swept away in the random erosion of centuries? Or was it left in the desert for a reason, hidden under a blanket of dust, because its words were never meant to resurface? The sand does not answer. It only waits, as it always has, for someone to keep digging. The first thing you notice is the absence. Whole leaves, missing edges, frayed to nothing, sentences that trail into air as if the speaker simply stopped breathing mid-thought. The surviving text of the Gospel of Mary is more like a shoreline after the tide scattered pieces of meaning, left clinging to the sand, their context washed away. You read them, and the mind immediately tries to fill the gaps, to imagine what might have stood between these lonely phrases. That instinct is natural. Dangerous, too. From what remains, the narrative opens in the middle of a conversation, not the polite introduction of a sermon, but a direct answer to an unrecorded question. The disciples are speaking with the risen Christ, who instructs them and then departs. It is in the silence after his leaving that the others turn to one another in fear and uncertainty. Mary speaks then, steady and reassuring, reminding them of his words, urging them not to be afraid. Already you feel the shift, She is not merely a listener. She is their comforter, their interpreter. Then comes a section, or rather the ghost of one, where she recounts a private vision. In it, she describes the ascent of the soul, past powers and rulers, each demanding to know its origin and purpose. The imagery is strange, vivid, almost theatrical in its symbolic weight. But here the manuscript breaks, and 4 consecutive pages are gone. Not a word survives from what could have been the core of her teaching. This missing portion has become one of the most argued over absences in Christian studies. Some scholars see it as deliberate suppression, a surgical removal, to blunt whatever challenge the vision might have posed to the emerging orthodoxy. Others suspect the simpler explanation loss through physical decay, a casualty of time rather than theology, and still others hover between the two, aware that accidents and intentions often weave together in history until they are inseparable. There is one obscure but telling detail in the remaining passages. Mary's speech contains a tone of gentle authority, a refusal to be diminished, even when her companions, in this case Peter and Andrew, question her right to speak. Peter accuses her of inventing her account. Andrew doubts it outright. Mary does not lash back. She lets another disciple, Levi, come to her defense, telling Peter he has always been quick to anger and slow to understand. It's a small moment, but in the surviving script, it lands like the echo of something much larger. That exchange has fueled a centuries-long conversation about authority in the early church, who was permitted to teach, whose testimony was accepted, whose was dismissed. The dynamic in these few lines feels familiar, almost modern, a replay of disputes in boardrooms, classrooms, and parliaments. It's tempting to see in it a timeless pattern, the challenge of a voice out of place in a hierarchy that never intended to make room for it. And here the callback to that first discovery in the desert feels inevitable, the same sense of defiance in ink of a voice that does not apologize for existing. Yet it is a fragile defiance, its edges literally crumbling. The temptation to reconstruct the missing verses grows each time you read the surviving ones, like an itch beneath the skin. Scholars have tried some proposing parallels with other Gnostic texts, others using linguistic patterns to guess at the content. But the truth is, no reconstruction can replace the original. You are left with a paradox. The more you study these fragments, the more they seem complete in themselves, carrying an emotional truth that no full text could dilute. And yet the gaps taunt you. They force you to ask what was so significant that whether by decay or decision, it was allowed to vanish. Outside, the desert is as still as ever. But in your mind, the missing pages flutter like banners in a wind. You cannot feel their blank spaces heavier than any words they might once have held. You can feel it in the way the words land. Mary is not asking for permission. She is speaking as someone who has already been entrusted with truth and who sees no need to apologize for it. In the Gospel of Mary, her voice carries the calm certainty of one who has stood in the presence of the risen Christ and returned with something to teach. It is not an imagined authority. It is granted in the narrative itself, as if the Gospel were deliberately constructed to make her role impossible to ignore. That is what unsettles people now, and almost certainly then. In the early church, authority was not a casual thing. It was bound up with questions of legitimacy, apostolic succession, and the delicate balance of leadership among the disciples. To see a woman, even one as respected as Mary Magdalene, step into that role in the text is to feel the quiet disruption it must have caused in communities that were still shaping their hierarchy. Historically, the early Christian movement was more fluid than the later rigid church it became. In the decades after Jesus' death, communities gathered in homes, leadership shifted, depending on gifts rather than titles, and women often hosted, taught, and prophesied. Archaeological evidence and epigraphic inscriptions record women named as deacons, apostles, and leaders in the first centuries. And yet over time these roles were narrowed, their memory dulled. Mary's Gospel, if indeed it reflected early oral traditions, preserves a moment before that narrowing, a snapshot of a church still open to multiple voices. The obscure but telling detail lies in the structure of her authority in the text. She is not portrayed as a rival to Christ's male disciples, but as someone filling a void left by his absence. The others falter. She steadies them. This is a different kind of leadership than the one later codified in councils and creeds, less about holding office, more about holding space. Yet it is precisely this form of authority that tends to vanish first when hierarchy hardens. Of course, not all scholars agree on the implications. Some read the Gospel as a theological allegory, with Mary functioning as a symbol of the soul or the church itself, rather than a record of actual events. Others insist it reflects genuine historical memory of her role in the movement, a living person whose presence was influential enough to spark resentment in others, much like the tense exchange with Peter preserved in the text. The debate over Mary's authority inevitably circles back to the gaps in the manuscript. Did the missing pages contain further teachings that would make her leadership even clearer? Or would they reveal something that complicates our present reading, perhaps a more mystical or symbolic role than a practical one? The desert, as always, refuses to give up such secrets easily. You think again of those early gatherings, the lamplight flickering on walls of mud brick, the murmur of conversation as people lean in to hear. Mary is at the center of it, not because she demanded the place, but because it was given to her by the weight of her witness. The moment is vivid, almost tangible, until you remember it exists for us only in ink and conjecture. And yet that faint image is enough to disturb the long-settled picture painted by later tradition. It makes you wonder how many other moments, how many other voices were lost before they could ever be written down. If this one has survived in fragments, perhaps others sleep still deep beneath the surface, waiting for the right hands to lift them into the light. The air in the room changes the moment Peter speaks. You can almost hear it in the lines of the text, a tightening, a pause. The unspoken ripple of tension that comes when someone of rank questions the legitimacy of another's voice. He does not hide his suspicion. Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge? The words hang heavy, both a challenge to Mary's credibility and an assertion of his own position. This confrontation is not a gentle disagreement. It is the collision of two kinds of authority, each rooted in the earliest days of the movement. Peter's comes from proximity to Jesus in life, his leadership recognized by many in the community. Mary's, at least in this text, comes from direct revelation, an inner vision, and private instruction from Christ after the resurrection. These two claims are not easily reconciled. Historically, disputes over authority in the early church were not rare. The New Testament itself preserves echoes of disagreements, Paul sparring with Peter in Antioch communities divided over whose teaching to follow. What makes the Gospel of Mary unusual is that it places a woman at the center of such a dispute, with the male leaders openly challenging her place. And unlike in most canonical narratives, the Gospel allows her to answer through her composure, not through defensive argument. An obscure but telling detail emerges in Levi's intervention. He turns to Peter and tells him he has always been quick to anger, that if the Savior found her worthy, who is Peter, to reject her. It is an extraordinary defense not just of Mary, but of the principle that authority can be conferred beyond established hierarchies. In that moment, Levi becomes a quiet pivot point, a reminder that the early movement was not monolithic, that loyalties and recognitions could shift in ways the later institutional church would struggle to accept. The scholarly debate over this passage is as much about tone as content. Some argue that Peter's challenge reflects a symbolic struggle between Orthodox and heterodox factions in the 2nd century, with Mary representing esoteric teaching and Peter representing emerging orthodoxy. Others see it as the memory of a real personality conflict preserved in story form because it captured something essential about the diversity and friction of the early community. You can sense the callback to earlier fragments here. The same Mary who steadied the disciples after Jesus' departure now stands before Peter's skepticism. The defiance is not in shouting him down, but in continuing to speak as though his challenge cannot erase her experience. It is the kind of strength that does not demand victory to remain intact. And yet the exchange leaves questions unresolved. Did Peter's doubt win the day in the community's memory, or did Mary's teaching continue to circulate despite him? The surviving manuscript offers no neat conclusion. All we know is that her voice, however contested, endured long enough to be written down and hidden away, perhaps for protection. Perhaps because those who opposed it had the power to remove it from the public record. You imagine the conversation ending in that dimly lit room, the murmurs subsiding, the decision about whose account to believe left hanging in the air. Outside, the dust would have carried on its slow work, indifferent to the human struggle within. And somewhere in that silence, the first seeds of the text's disappearance might already have been taking root. The surviving pages draw you in with their sudden shift. The conversation in the room fades, replaced by Mary's own account of what she has seen and experienced so strange it feels more like a dream than a memory, yet is delivered with the clarity of someone describing a place she has actually been. She speaks of the soul's ascent after death, rising through layers of existence, each one guarded by powers that demand to know who it is and where it comes from. Her vision is rich with imagery, almost theatrical in its arrangement. The powers, sometimes called archons in similar literature, are not faceless obstacles. They are personalities, each representing a force the soul must overcome: ignorance, desire, wrath. The surviving portion shows the soul answering these challenges, declaring its freedom from their grip. Then, just as the narrative gathers force, the text breaks again, 4 missing pages opening like a chasm beneath the reader's feet. That gap is one of the most tantalizing in early Christian studies. Some scholars think the missing portion contained the climax of the vision, perhaps an encounter with the divine or a final statement about the soul's ultimate destiny. Others suspect it might have contained teachings that diverged sharply from what became official doctrine, enough to make their survival inconvenient. The debate has never been settled, in part because the existing content already strains the boundaries of orthodox thought. One obscure but telling feature of Mary's vision is its lack of emphasis on physical resurrection or the Last Judgment central tenets in much of the New Testament. Instead, the focus is on personal liberation from the powers that bind the soul, a theme found in certain Gnostic writings. This isn't about waiting for a distant apocalypse. It's about transformation now in the soul's ongoing journey. The absence of judgmental overtones is striking and for some troubling. If you let your mind drift back to that earlier exchange with Peter, you can feel the underlying connection. Mary's authority in the Gospel is grounded not in the retelling of Jesus' public acts, but in this deeply personal, mystical encounter. It is the kind of authority that cannot be transferred, only experienced, and therefore is nearly impossible to regulate. For a church seeking uniform teaching, this kind of vision is both dangerous and difficult to dismiss outright. It is worth remembering that visions were not uncommon in the early Christian world. Paul speaks of being caught up to the third heaven. John writes of his revelation on Patmos. Peter dreams of unclean animals and a divine command to eat. But Mary's vision stands apart in tone and scope, centering the agency of the soul and the voice of a woman as its interpreter. You picture her telling it, perhaps in a dim room lit by oil lamps, the listeners half in shadow. Some lean forward, drawn by the strangeness, the promise of something more than they have been told. Others sit back, guarded, suspicious of where this path might lead. The division is almost palpable, and yet the words go on, carrying their own quiet momentum. The missing pages ensure we will never fully know what she saw, what she thought was worth preserving. But sometimes the absence itself becomes part of the message. The veil is not lifted entirely. It hangs still, a reminder that some truths in history are only ever seen in glimpses, just enough to let you know they exist. The parchment may speak in words, but it also speaks in fibers, inks, and the shapes of letters. Before anyone can decide what the Gospel of Mary means, they must decide when it was written. That question is a riddle with no single satisfying answer, and the closer you lean into it, the more the lines blur between certainty and conjecture. The surviving manuscript, the Coptic Codex found in Egypt, has been dated paleographically to the 5th century. This is the copy we hold in our hands, the one whose pages are cracked and missing, whose ink has faded into the color of desert bone. But a copy is not a composition. Even the most conservative scholars agree that the text itself must be older than this physical artifact. How much older is where the debates turn sharp. Some place its origin in the late 2nd century, pointing to its thematic overlap with other writings from that period, a focus on inner knowledge, the prominence of visionary experience, and a theology less concerned with physical resurrection than with spiritual liberation. Others push for a 3rd century date, citing the sophistication of its dialogue and its possible awareness of developing church structures. The most adventurous voices suggest it could reach back to the 1st century, drawing on oral traditions from those who had actually known Mary. An obscure but telling detail in the argument is the Gospel's linguistic layering. The Coptic version we possess was translated from Greek, and the Greek itself may have been influenced by Semitic idioms. That linguistic echo hints at an origin in communities where multiple languages mingled, places like Alexandria, Antioch, or even Jerusalem's cosmopolitan fringes before the city's destruction in 70 CE. Traces of such multilingual environments are rare and often overlooked, but here they leave their faint fingerprint. As you think back to the fragments themselves, you can feel how the dating debate changes their weight. If the text emerged in the 2nd century, it belongs to a moment when Christian identity was still fluid and diverse interpretations flourished before orthodoxy set its boundaries. If it is later, it might be a protest, a deliberate revival of older marginalized voices at a time when the church's hierarchy was tightening. In either case, its appearance is a flare in the night sky of history, visible only briefly before darkness closes in again. Radiocarbon dating has been suggested for the manuscript, but its fragility and the small amount of organic material it would require make such tests risky. Scholars rely instead on comparisons, the shapes of letters, the style of binding, the way the ink bleeds into the fibers. It is a slow, meticulous work, less about epiphany than about assembling probabilities. And yet, as with all ancient texts, the search for a precise date may be less important than what the uncertainty reveals. The Gospel of Mary lives in the liminal space between centuries, close enough to the roots of the faith to speak with an early accent, yet shaped by currents of thought that would later be deemed suspect. You imagine the first scribe copying the words from an older source, perhaps aware that he was preserving something already rare. He could not have known that 1,500 years later we would hold his work under magnifying lenses, parsing the age of each curve of ink. But perhaps he knew this much, that some voices are worth carrying forward, even if the road ahead is uncertain. It's strange to think that the Gospel of Mary exists for us, not as a single whole book, but as a patchwork of survivors, each fragment like a rescued plank from a shipwreck. The most substantial is the Coptic version found in the Berlin Codex, its pages worn thin as if the text had been read and reread before the desert sealed it away. But it is not alone. Two much older Greek fragments, smaller and more delicate than a palm, have also emerged from the sands of Egypt. Each holds just enough words to confirm the Gospel's existence in another language centuries before the Coptic copy was penned. The Berlin Codex itself is a fascinating artifact. Acquired by a German collector in Cairo in the late 19th century, it passed through several hands before scholars began to examine it in earnest. Inside, alongside the Gospel of Mary, rest other texts that share its air of unorthodoxy: the Apocryphon of John, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, the Act of Peter. It's a library in miniature, a collection that hints at the theological breadth of the community that once guarded it. The arrangement alone suggests these works were not seen as marginal curiosities, but as part of a coherent spiritual worldview. Then there are the Greek fragments unearthed in the early 20th century at Oxyrhynchus, a city whose rubbish heaps have yielded more papyri than perhaps any other site in the world. These scraps predate the Coptic manuscript by several centuries, likely from the 3rd century, possibly earlier. They contain portions of the Gospel's middle sections enough to prove that the text was circulating in Greek well before its translation into Coptic. And yet, frustratingly, the Greek and Coptic passages do not overlap. Each preserves different sections, so the missing pieces in one cannot be filled by the other. An obscure but telling detail lies in the wear patterns of these manuscripts. The Coptic pages show signs of repeated handling, as though the text was in active use before it was hidden or lost. The Greek fragments, in contrast, were found among discarded papers, suggesting they were cast aside, perhaps because they were damaged, or perhaps because they had been replaced by newer copies. The contrast invites speculation. Was the Gospel's transmission interrupted by disapproval? Or did it simply follow the normal life cycle of ancient texts, wearing out and being recopied, until one day no one bothered to replace it? The survival of these manuscripts at all feels almost accidental. Papyrus does not forgive damp or neglect, and the odds of even a single sheet lasting 2 millennia are slim. That we have 3 separate witnesses to this gospel suggests it was once more widespread than its rarity today implies. The pieces we hold are not random flukes. They are the faint shadows of a distribution now mostly erased. If you let your mind drift back to the vision Mary recounts, you might imagine these manuscripts as the soul in her story, passing through gatekeepers, surviving challenges, shedding parts of themselves along the way. What reached us is incomplete, but still carries the essence of what once was. And like her soul's ascent, the journey of the gospel through history is not a straight line, but a winding path through hands both protective and indifferent. Somewhere, perhaps still in the dust of an unexcavated storeroom, or in the binding of a reused parchment, more of her voice could remain. The desert, for all its silence, has a way of giving up what it hides, but only when it chooses. The disappearance of the Gospel of Mary is not the clean, vanishing act of a single moment. It is a slow, fading like ink in sunlight, the work of years and shifting currents of power. You can trace the outlines of the process, but never quite fix the moment when the voice slipped beneath the surface, It is tempting to imagine some dramatic suppression bishops ordering copies, burned scribes tearing pages from codices, and while that might have happened in isolated cases, the reality is often less theatrical and more insidious. The early Christian world was full of competing ideas, some of them wildly different from the teachings that would later become orthodoxy. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, many communities welcomed variety in theology. You could walk into one gathering and hear about bodily resurrection, then visit another the same evening and be told the resurrection was purely spiritual. For a time, this diversity was tolerated, but as Christianity spread and solidified, leaders began to recognize the political necessity of unity. A single creed is easier to defend than a dozen conflicting ones. The Gospel of Mary's emphasis on inner knowledge, personal vision, and a female teacher made it an awkward fit for a faith moving towards centralized, male-led authority. This isn't conjecture alone. Church fathers like Irenaeus and Tertullian wrote scathing attacks on what they saw as dangerous deviations from true teaching, often targeting texts and teachers outside the emerging canon. Mary's Gospel is never mentioned by name in those surviving polemics, but the kinds of ideas it carries, the downplaying of physical resurrection, the challenge to male apostolic primacy, fall squarely into the category of works they sought to marginalize. An obscure but telling detail can be found in how manuscripts were copied. Scribes generally worked from texts provided by their community's leadership. If a text was not approved, it simply wasn't recopied, and over time it would disappear through neglect alone. No flames, no mobs, just the quiet decision to let the work die. In a world before printing, presses, the survival of any writing depended entirely on someone choosing to make a new copy. Thinking back to the Berlin Codex and the Greek fragments, you see how this quiet erasure might have worked. A text could survive in fringe communities valued by a few but ignored by the majority. Eventually, those communities disappear or are absorbed, and the text slips into the realm of forgotten things. Only in the exceptional case, a buried codex, a lost library sealed in the desert, does it have a chance of returning. The scholarly debate here is not over whether the gospel was marginalized, but why. Some argue it was purely theological, its ideas clashed with the dominant narrative, and were set aside for that reason. Others suggest social pressures played as much a role, that Mary's prominence in the text was simply unacceptable to a leadership eager to present a unified male-led image of the apostolic circle. In truth, both forces may have worked together, tightening the net, until her gospel could no longer pass through. You can almost picture the last copy in active use, a small group reading it aloud, perhaps in whispers, perhaps with no awareness that they are holding one of the final surviving voices of its kind. And then one day, it is set down and not picked up again. The dust begins to settle. The voice grows faint. What remains for us is not the record of its silencing, but the improbable fact of its return. And that perhaps is its quietest defiance, that even after the long work of forgetting the desert still delivered her back to us. If you listen closely to the rhythm of Mary's Gospel, you can hear a faint harmony with other voices once labeled heretical. The language of ascent, the emphasis on inner revelation, the stripping away of powers that bind the soul, these are hallmarks of a family of thought the early church would come to call Gnostic. The term itself was never a badge these communities wore. It was a label applied by their critics, a convenient box in which to place anything that smelled of secret knowledge. In the centuries when Christianity was still finding its boundaries, Gnostic currents ran strong. They were not a single unified movement, but a wide stream of ideas and schools, from Valentinus's sophisticated theology to the more mythic cosmologies of Scythian texts. What they shared was a conviction that salvation came through knowledge gnosis, not in the modern sense of information, but as an intimate, transformative knowing of the divine. In this view, the material world was often seen as flawed, or even the work of a lesser creator, and the soul's journey was a process of awakening from this forgetful exile. The Gospel of Mary does not fit neatly into any one Gnostic school, but its affinities are unmistakable. The vision she describes, in which the soul ascends past the grip of hostile powers, echoes the journeys found in works like the Apocryphon of John or the Pistis Sophia. Its rejection of fear as an obstacle to spiritual understanding, its insistence that the truth lies within, align with the core Gnostic impulse toward inward discovery. An obscure but telling detail appears in the Gospel's absence of elaborate creation myths, which many Gnostic texts use as their framework. Instead, Mary's account is spare, almost minimalist, focused on the immediate struggle of the soul, rather than the architecture of the cosmos. This leanness suggests either that the author drew on Gnostic themes without adopting their full system, or that the missing pages once contained more mythic material now lost to us. Here, the callback to earlier discussions of suppression becomes unavoidable. If Mary's Gospel was circulating among communities influenced by Gnostic thought, its marginalization would have been swift once the bishops began to define orthodoxy against false teachings. By the 4th century, with imperial backing, the Church had the authority not only to decide which texts were acceptable, but also to publicly denounce those outside the approved canon. The Gnostic label became a kind of scarlet letter, ensuring that such works would be copied only in secret, if at all. Modern scholarship is divided on whether to call the Gospel of Mary Gnostic at all. Some resist the term, arguing that it forces the text into a category created by its enemies and distorts its original context. Others see value in the connection, not as a dismissal, but as a way to map the intellectual world in which it moved. In either case, the Gospel's resonance with these banned traditions helps explain why it vanished from the mainstream. You can imagine it being read in a small gathering, perhaps alongside other texts now in the Berlin Codex, the listeners nodding at the familiar pattern of ascent and liberation. They might have seen no conflict between this gospel and their devotion to Christ, no reason why Mary's vision could not sit alongside Peter's preaching or John's prologue. The divisions that would later become unbridgeable were in that moment still just hairline cracks. But those cracks would widen. And in the space between them, Mary's voice, like so many others, would slip through, carried away into the long silence that only the desert knows how to keep. By the time the 4th century dawned, the lines had been drawn more sharply than ever before. The once fluid marketplace of early Christian ideas had narrowed into a guarded corridor, with only certain doors left open. Orthodoxy, a word that simply means right belief, was no longer just a theological preference. It was a political instrument. It defined who belonged inside the protection of the Church and who stood outside in the chill air of heresy. The Gospel of Mary, with its quiet but unmistakable challenges to emerging dogma, belonged firmly in the category of what was other. Not because it rejected Christ, it does not, but because it presents him in a way that resists the institutional scaffolding being built around his memory. Here is a Savior who entrusts crucial teaching to a woman who affirms her vision and who appears less concerned with enforcing ritual or creed than with awakening courage in the soul. The early Church's march toward uniformity was driven by more than just concern for doctrinal purity. There was also the question of survival. A fragmented Christianity splintered into countless interpretations would be far more vulnerable to both internal schism and external pressure. A unified creed, a closed canon, these were shields, as much as they were statements of faith. And in the forging of those shields, anything that did not fit neatly was hammered flat or discarded. An obscure but telling episode from this period is the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. While the Gospel of Mary was not on the table for discussion there, the Council's focus was on Christ's divinity, and the Arian controversy, the spirit of the gathering, reveals the wider pattern. The bishops met to decide once and for all which teachings were acceptable and which would be denounced. This atmosphere left little room for the kinds of visionary individualized authority the Gospel represents. Thinking back to the Gnostic connections, you can see how the currents of suppression converged. By now, the label Gnostic had become shorthand for untrustworthy suspect and dangerously divisive. Even without naming Mary's Gospel directly, the Church's sweeping denunciations of alternative teachings would have effectively frozen it out of the mainstream. Once the stream of new copies dried up, the text's survival depended entirely on the periphery communities already under pressure, already shrinking. Scholars today argue over whether this consolidation of orthodoxy was inevitable. Some see it as the natural outcome of any growing movement. Boundaries must be drawn, rules must be set. Others view it as a loss, a closing of doors that once allowed for richer, more varied expressions of faith. In this tension, the Gospel of Mary stands as a kind of phantom witness, a reminder that what we call the early Church was not always as unified as later history might suggest. You imagine the choice faced by a scribe in that era. Before him lie several texts, some approved, others suspect. He knows which ones his bishop expects to see preserved. He also knows that to copy the wrong text could invite suspicion or worse. His stylus hovers, then moves toward the safer choice. Somewhere else, another scribe makes the same decision. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mary's voice recedes from the chorus. But not entirely. Even in the narrowing corridors of orthodoxy, there are cracks where light slips through. And through one of those cracks, centuries later, the faint sound of her teaching would return, altered, incomplete, but still carrying the shape of something that refused to be erased. Before the fragments of her own gospel ever saw the sun again, Mary Magdalene had already been living for centuries in the pages of the Bible, but not in the same form we see in the Coptic Codex. In the canonical Gospels, she is a presence on the edges of the story, yet her appearances are charged with unusual weight. She is among the women who followed Jesus, who witnessed the crucifixion when many of the men have fled, and most strikingly, she is the first recorded witness to the resurrection. That single moment described in all four Gospels with varying details should by itself have secured her a place of unshakable prominence, and yet her portrayal is uneven. In Luke's account, she is introduced as a woman from whom 7 demons had gone out, a phrase that invites speculation, often uncharitably. Mark names her among the witnesses, but gives her no speech. Matthew has her meet the risen Christ alongside the other Mary. Only in John's telling does she have a long personal exchange with him in the garden, mistaking him for the gardener until he calls her by name. It is here that he entrusts her with the message to deliver to the others a commission so significant that later tradition would call her the apostle to the apostles. An obscure but telling shift happens in the centuries after these texts are written. Her role as first witness remains in the record, but her authority is not expanded in the way Peter's or Paul's is. No canonical book bears her name. No epistle preserves her teaching. By the time the Church solidifies its leadership structures, she is revered as a saint, but not as a foundational teacher. Her public memory is of devotion, not doctrine. Thinking back to the Gospel of Mary, the contrast is stark. In the canonical accounts, she is the bearer of news. In her own Gospel, she is the bearer of interpretation. One is a role that can be honored without altering the hierarchy. The other invites direct participation in shaping the faith. The absence of the latter from the canon is perhaps less about its theological content and more about its implications for authority. Modern readers sometimes forget that the formation of the canon was not just a matter of gathering the oldest or most accurate texts. It was a process of selection shaped by theology politics and the needs of the communities making the decisions. In that process, Mary's role was trimmed to fit the narrative, leaving behind a figure both important and safely contained. You might picture the moment in John's Gospel when she runs to tell the disciples she has seen the Lord. The urgency is there, the joy, but also perhaps the awareness that the weight of her words will depend entirely on whether they choose to believe her. That dynamic, captured in a few verses, foreshadows the tension her own gospel makes explicit. It is that tension between being seen and being heard that continues to echo when you turn from the Bible's pages to the brittle leaves found in the desert. The same woman stands in both, but in one she speaks far more freely, as if no one has yet learned how to quiet her. It is early, the sky still holding the last shades of night, when Mary comes to the tomb. The Gospels place her there while the city sleeps, before the first bird calls, before the merchants open their stalls. The air must have been cool, the stone damp with dew. She comes, John says, alone. Other accounts have her with companions, but in all of them she is among the first, and in the telling that matters most to her legacy, she is the very first to encounter the risen Christ. That moment in John's Gospel is written with unusual intimacy. She weeps outside the tomb, sees the two angels within, turns, and sees him but does not recognize him until he says her name. Mary. It is a simple word, but in the narrative it breaks the spell. She answers, Rabboni, teacher. There is no theological lecture here, no creed, just recognition. He tells her not to cling to him, and then, in the most understated commission imaginable, instructs her to go to his brothers and tell them what she has seen. It is a strange and delicate authority, the charge to proclaim the central mystery of the faith before anyone else. In the ancient world, the testimony of women was often considered less credible than that of men. The fact that all four Gospels place women as the first witnesses is, in historical terms, startling. Some scholars argue it is an indication of authenticity. An invented story might have chosen a more socially persuasive witness. Others see it as an intentional inversion, a statement about the kingdom of God overturning human hierarchies. An obscure but telling point lies in what happens next. In Luke, when the women report the resurrection, the apostles dismiss it as an idle tale. In Mark's shorter ending, the women flee in fear and say nothing to anyone. In Matthew, the disciples meet Jesus in Galilee, but there is no record of their response to Mary's news. Only John's account allows her report to stand without dismissal. Yet even there, the focus soon shifts to the male disciples' encounters. Thinking back to the confrontation with Peter in her own gospel, the pattern feels familiar. Whether in narrative or in memory, her authority is both granted and immediately contested. She carries the most momentous news in Christian history, but she is not the one who gets to preach it from the center of the community. You imagine the weight of that morning. The scent of stone and spices in the air, the sound of footsteps on gravel as she leaves the garden, the words forming in her mind before she reaches the others. Perhaps she expects them to share her joy immediately. Perhaps she knows even then that belief is not guaranteed. Either way, her role in that dawn is fixed. She is the one who sees first, who hears first, who is sent first. And yet, over time, this extraordinary commission is wrapped in softer fabrics. She becomes the penitent, the devoted follower, the symbol of personal repentance. The harder edge of her role, the directness of her encounter, is dulled. Only in the brittle pages of her own gospel does she speak again in a voice that sounds like someone who once stood in a garden at daybreak, called by name, into a task she could never refuse. By the time the Gospel of Mary had slipped from sight, another version of Mary Magdalene had begun to take its place, not through archaeology or accident, but through the deliberate shaping of her image by those who told the Church's story. In the hands of influential Church fathers, her identity was reframed, her authority softened, and her memory repurposed to serve theological and moral ends. The most famous turn came in 591 CE when Pope Gregory the Great delivered a homily that would echo through more than a millennium of Christian thought. In it, he fused three separate women from the New Testament into one figure, Mary of Magdala, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet in Luke's Gospel. Without textual warrant, he declared them to be the same person, and in doing so transformed Mary Magdalene from a prominent witness and disciple into a repentant prostitute. The shift was not subtle. It reframed her life as a cautionary tale of sin redeemed by penitence, sidelining her role as teacher and first witness to the resurrection. An obscure but telling detail in Gregory's homily is the way he dwells on the ointment the sinful woman uses, associating its aroma with the sweetness of repentance. In this retelling, her identity becomes inseparable from her moral transformation, a move that places her firmly within a paradigm the Church was eager to promote: the fallen woman saved by submission to grace. The apostolic authority she carried in John's Gospel, and even more so in her own, was quietly erased. Not all early commentators agreed with Gregory's conflation, but his interpretation gained extraordinary traction in the Latin West. Over centuries, it became the dominant image of Mary in sermons, art, and devotional literature. Painted in rich robes or with loosened hair, she appeared in chapels as a symbol of contrition, her jar of ointment as recognizable as Peter's keys or Paul's sword. In the East, where the conflation was largely rejected, she retained more of her original stature as equal to the apostles. But in the West, the damage to her public identity was complete. Looking back to the fragments of the Gospel of Mary, the contrast is striking. In the Codex, she stands before the disciples with composure, challenging their fear, even absorbing Peter's skepticism without retreat. In the Church Fathers' retelling, she is defined by past shame, not present authority. The shift is more than a matter of character. It alters the entire lens through which her place in the story is viewed. Modern scholarship often treats this as a textbook example of character assassination. Not the crude smear of an enemy, but the quiet reconfiguration of a figure until her most disruptive traits disappear. Once transformed, she could be celebrated without challenging the structures that had risen in her absence. You can almost imagine what it would have meant if her own gospel had remained widely read during those centuries, a steady counterpoint to the penitential image, a reminder that she had once been portrayed as an equal among leaders. Instead, her reimagining held sway for over 1,000 years, so complete that even now in popular imagination, she often appears first as the sinner, and only second, if at all, as the apostle. The work of recovering her voice, then, is not only about piecing together ancient manuscripts. It is about peeling away centuries of imposed identity to find beneath the layers the woman who once spoke of visions beyond the veil and who was bold enough to stand her ground in the company of men who doubted her. Mary's voice is not the only one that has faded from the official record. Her case may be the most famous, but it is part of a larger pattern, a slow erasure of women's authority from the story of the early Church. When you widen the lens, other names begin to surface like stones in a receding tide, each carrying a trace of leadership that would later be diminished or forgotten. In the letters of Paul, for instance, you find Phoebe described as a deacon and benefactor, Junia greeted as prominent among the apostles, Priscilla, who with her husband Aquila, is credited with instructing a prominent preacher in the way of God more accurately. These are not marginal figures. They appear in the earliest strata of Christian writing. And yet, over the centuries, their significance was blunted. Junia's name was even altered in later manuscripts, to the masculine Junias, a small stroke of the pen that effectively removed a female apostle from memory for almost 1,000 years. An obscure but telling example comes from Thecla, a legendary companion of Paul, whose story survives in the apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla. In this text, she baptizes herself, preaches openly, and survives attempts on her life with miraculous aid. Early Christians revered her as a model of female discipleship, and her cult spread widely in the East. But her acts were never included in the canon, and her autonomy was downplayed in later retellings. Mary's Gospel fits this wider pattern. Women appear in the earliest records as leaders, teachers, and patrons' roles that shrink as the institutional church consolidates power. It is not that their stories were erased entirely. Many were preserved in hagiographies or liturgical memory. But the framing changed. Authority became service, leadership became piety, and the disruptive possibility of women shaping doctrine from the center of the faith was gently or forcefully removed. Thinking back to the confrontation with Peter in Mary's own text, you can see how her treatment mirrors these other examples. The skepticism she faces in the Gospel becomes over centuries the skepticism built into the Church's historical memory. If her Gospel had survived in common circulation, it might have kept alive the image of a woman who stood at the center of teaching, not just at the edge of the story. Scholars still debate the reasons for this decline in female leadership. Some point to the influence of Greco-Roman social norms which valued male authority in public life. Others highlight theological developments that linked priesthood to the imagery of Christ as male, excluding women by symbolic logic. Whatever the cause, the effect is the same: a narrowing of the roles available to women until figures like Mary could be honored as saints, but not imitated as leaders. You imagine those lost voices as a kind of invisible choir, their melodies faint but still present beneath the louder, sanctioned harmonies. The Gospel of Mary is one of the few surviving solos from that chorus. A reminder that the sound of the early church was once more varied than the later record suggests. And in that reminder lies a question the centuries have not answered. If their voices had been preserved alongside the others, how differently might the story of Christianity have been told? If you strip away the missing pages and the centuries of dust, what remains of Mary's Gospel still carries ideas that would have landed like stones in the calm pool of emerging orthodoxy. Chief among them is the shift in focus from external authority to inner awakening, the insistence that the soul's journey is not bound by the approval of earthly gatekeepers. In her account, salvation is not earned by adherence to ritual or mediated through a rigid hierarchy, but through a direct personal encounter with the divine. This is not an abstract philosophical nuance. It has real consequences for how a faith community organizes itself. If divine truth can be received by anyone anywhere without the sanction of an institution, then the very premise of centralized authority is unsettled. Mary's vision presents a spiritual landscape where guidance is given, but the path must be walked in the soul's own strength. Christ in this telling does not position himself as the sole dispenser of wisdom, but as one who affirms the revelation Mary has already received. An obscure but telling detail in the text is the way fear is treated. The disciples left anxious after Christ's departure are comforted not by a promise of divine intervention, but by Mary's reminder to replace fear with understanding. In many traditional frameworks, fear of God is framed as the beginning of wisdom. Here, fear is an obstacle, a weight to be shed in order to see clearly. That inversion alone would have raised eyebrows in communities where obedience was enforced through the language of reverence and awe. Thinking back to the Gnostic resonances we explored earlier, you can see how these teachings overlap without fully merging. Mary's Gospel shares the emphasis on knowledge as liberation, but avoids the elaborate mythologies of many Gnostic texts. It keeps the vision grounded in lived relationships and immediate encouragement. This balance, mystical yet personal, makes it harder to dismiss as the product of an isolated sect, and perhaps even more threatening for that reason. The debate among modern scholars often revolves around whether Mary's Gospel advocates for a radically egalitarian spirituality or simply reflects a community where such ideas were still possible. If the former, it could be seen as a deliberate challenge to the growing power of bishops and councils. If the latter, it is a window into a world where diversity of thought had not yet been fully pruned away. Either way, its theology does not lend itself easily to control from above. You can imagine how such a text might have been received by those tasked with keeping doctrine uniform. It would be easy enough to praise Mary's devotion while quietly ignoring the content of her teaching. Over time, that selective remembrance would leave her as a model of faithfulness without making her a model for leadership or independent revelation. And yet, the surviving lines resist that narrowing. Even in their fragmentary state, they present a vision of faith that moves from the inside out, from transformation within to action without. It is a voice that assumes its hearers are capable of discerning truth for themselves, and that perhaps is the most radical implication of all. If you scan the records of the great councils of the Church Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, you will not find the Gospel of Mary mentioned. Its name is absent from the anathemas, the decrees, the long lists of condemned writings. It is not attacked directly, not weighed and found, wanting not even named among the curiosities of the heretical fringe. It is as if for the official record it never existed at all. At first glance, that absence might seem strange. The councils were thorough in their declarations, sparing little ink in denouncing teachings they saw as dangerous. But the silence may be less a mystery than a clue. For a text to be condemned, it must be known widely enough to be considered a threat. By the time the great councils met, the Gospel of Mary may have already been pushed so far to the margins that it was no longer on the agenda. Erasure by neglect is quieter than erasure by fire, but just as final. An obscure but telling detail emerges when you consider the council's approach to authority. These gatherings were not simply theological seminars. They were acts of consolidation. Their purpose was to create a unified, enforceable framework of belief across a vast and growing empire. Any teaching that placed interpretive authority in the hands of individuals, especially those outside the episcopal hierarchy, undercut the very premise of the councils themselves. A text like Mary's, with its emphasis on personal revelation and the validation of a woman's teaching, needed no formal condemnation to be incompatible with that vision. Thinking back to earlier patterns of suppression, you can see how the silence fits the broader arc. A gospel like Mary's would survive only where communities valued it enough to keep copying it. Without such support, the supply of manuscripts would dwindle. By the time bishops met under imperial roofs to debate the nature of Christ or the proper date of Easter, her voice was already locked away in small, scattered gatherings, if it was heard at all. The scholarly debate on this silence is divided. Some argue that the council's omission proves the gospel was never influential enough to warrant attention. Others suggest that the lack of direct mention was a strategic choice, that drawing public attention to it might have revived interest in its contents. The absence in this view is itself a form of containment. You can almost picture the council chambers, the air thick with incense, the shuffling of parchment, the steady murmur of debate in Greek and Latin. Outside scrolls and codices lie in private collections, some cherished, some neglected. The men within are crafting a faith for an empire. The manuscripts beyond their reach are slipping quietly into the long night of obscurity. And so the councils never speak her name. They do not have to. The structures they build make her return almost impossible until the desert decides otherwise. When you think of the disappearance of a text, the mind often goes to fire to the quick destruction of parchment and ink under the heat of deliberate destruction. But the Gospel of Mary may have met a quieter fate, one that required no malice at all. The monasteries of Egypt, Palestine, and Syria were treasure houses of writing, yet they were also vaults where certain works could lie untouched for centuries. Imagine a small desert monastery, its stone walls weathered by sun and wind. Inside the library is no grand hall, but a narrow room lined with wooden shelves. Scrolls and codices sit wrapped in linen, some freshly copied, others brittle from age. Here, the decision about which books are read aloud in the refectory and which remain wrapped in silence is made not by councils, but by abbots and scribes, guided by custom preference and the shifting winds of orthodoxy. The Gospel of Mary, if it reached such a place, could easily have been filed away in a stack of non-liturgical works, kept for reference, perhaps even for private study, but never used in public worship. Over time, the young scribes might have forgotten why it was kept at all. Without being recopied, its pages would grow fragile, its binding would loosen, and eventually it might be moved to the back of a shelf behind the works, still considered useful. An obscure but telling clue comes from the history of the Nag Hammadi codices discovered in 1945. These too were hidden away, possibly by monks at a nearby Pachomian monastery, after a decree against heretical books. The easiest way to preserve a forbidden or unfashionable text was not to burn it, but to store it somewhere it would not be seen. In a way, the desert's dryness became a co-conspirator, keeping safe what the church no longer valued. Thinking back to the Berlin Codex, you can almost imagine its journey copied in one monastery, stored in another, perhaps traded quietly to a merchant, perhaps lost in the estate of a monk who had kept it for personal interest. At every stage, its survival depended less on public defense and more on quiet neglect, the paradox of being spared destruction precisely because no one thought it worth the trouble to destroy. Scholars have speculated that the missing pages of Mary's Gospel might still exist in some unexamined cache. Vast collections of papyri and parchments remain uncatalogued in monastery libraries, especially in the Middle East. Many are written in Coptic, Syriac, or Greek, their content unknown except to the few who have opened them. The odds are slim, but not impossible. A single overlooked codex could change everything we think we know about her teachings. You picture a scribe in the 5th century, carefully pressing the pages flat as he copies each line. He has no way of knowing which texts will one day be declared essential and which will be set aside. His task is not to decide, only to preserve. And because of that silent labor, the voice that might have been lost entirely still waits patient in the quiet company of other forgotten works. The desert keeps its secrets in layers. Some are shallow, a shift of wind, and a day's digging can bring them to light. Others are buried deep sealed in clay jars or hidden in the thick bindings of forgotten books. For scholars and archaeologists, the surviving fragments of the Gospel of Mary are both a treasure and a torment, proof that her voice once traveled farther than we imagined, and a constant reminder that most of it is still missing. The discovery of the Berlin Codex and the Oxyrhynchus papyri proved that Mary's Gospel was not a singular anomaly, but part of a broader textual landscape. That realization fuels the hope and the chase for more. Archaeological expeditions in Egypt, especially in the Fayum and Upper Nile regions, have long targeted ancient rubbish mounds and abandoned settlements. These sites, where papyrus was discarded alongside broken pottery and food waste, have yielded everything from tax receipts to lost plays of Menander. It is entirely possible that somewhere among the unexamined bundles in storerooms lies another portion of Mary's Gospel. An obscure but telling source of potential recovery is the practice of reusing parchment. In later centuries, older manuscripts were sometimes scraped clean and overwritten, a process called palimpsesting. Modern imaging technologies using ultraviolet and multispectral light can sometimes reveal the erased layers beneath. Already such methods have resurrected forgotten works of classical science, theology, and philosophy. It is not unthinkable that a reused parchment in a monastery's archive could hide a section of Mary's teaching. Thinking back to her vision of the soul passing through hostile powers, you can't help but draw a quiet parallel. Each fragment of her gospel must pass its own gauntlet to reach us, slipping past decay, neglect, and accident. Some may still be trapped like the soul in her account, at the threshold of a final release into light. The scholarly debate over where to search next is part science, part instinct. Some argue for targeted digs in sites already known for papyrus finds. Others advocate combing through the uncatalogued collections of old expeditions where mislabeled or overlooked fragments might be waiting. The work is slow, underfunded, and often caught between academic caution and the lure of sensational discovery. There's also the delicate matter of access. Many manuscript collections in the Middle East are in regions where political instability makes sustained archaeological work difficult. In some cases, even known holdings are inaccessible due to local restrictions or fragile conditions. Every year, the chance of loss grows. Termites mold, or a single damp season could destroy what centuries of desert preservation have protected. And yet, the search continues. In storerooms thick with dust, in the quiet examination rooms of conservation labs, and in the shimmering heat of excavation sites, her voice still seems just out of reach. Perhaps one day a worker will lift the lid of a forgotten box and see the familiar curves of Coptic script, the ink still dark after 1,000 years. In that moment, the long silence would break, and the missing pages would begin to speak again. From the moment the first fragments of the Gospel of Mary reached academic hands, the tension was set. The scholars wanted to study, translate, and publish. The Church, or at least certain voices within it, preferred discretion. This is not an unfamiliar pattern. Many texts recovered from the margins of Christian history have met with the same push and pull, a contest not always of hostility, but often of control over interpretation. When the Berlin Codex was acquired in the late 19th century, it did not immediately become the subject of public excitement. Decades passed before the first full translation was available, partly due to the painstaking nature of the work, and partly due to the reluctance of some custodians to release photographs or facsimiles. Officially, such delays were framed as necessary for scholarly accuracy. Unofficially, whispers suggested that the content might prove confusing or destabilizing for the average believer. An obscure but telling episode occurred in the mid-20th century when access to certain non-canonical manuscripts, including the Nag Hammadi texts, was restricted to a small circle of scholars for years. Critics called it a bottleneck, a way of controlling the narrative by deciding who got to speak first about the discoveries. Defenders insisted it was simply the price of careful professional handling. The Gospel of Mary was caught in the same dynamic, tantalizing references, appeared in academic footnotes, long before the public could read the text for themselves. Thinking back to the silence of the councils and the slow erasure from liturgical life, the modern reluctance feels like an echo of older instincts. If a text challenges the boundaries of established teaching, there is a reflex to manage how and whether it enters the wider conversation. The Church, shaped by centuries of guarding orthodoxy, approaches such material with caution. Scholars, by training and temperament, are inclined to pull it into the light. The debate is not purely adversarial. Some clerics have welcomed the Gospel's recovery as an opportunity to explore early Christian diversity. Others see it as a historical artifact with no bearing on doctrine, a curiosity to be acknowledged, but not celebrated. Still others in both camps are wary of how sensationalized the story can become in popular media, where nuanced theological questions are often boiled down to simple narratives of suppression and scandal. Meanwhile, the scholarly community wrestles with its own gatekeeping. Academic editions can be prohibitively expensive, translations may be locked behind paywalls, and the technical language used to describe the text can make it inaccessible to all but specialists. In the end, the obstacles to hearing Mary's voice are not just theological, but practical, a combination of institutional caution and scholarly insularity. You imagine her gospel lying on a table between two people, one robed in the vestments of office, the other with ink-stained fingers, each convinced they are the better guardian of its meaning. Between them, the brittle pages wait silent for someone willing to turn them without fear. Long after her gospel had slipped from sight, Mary Magdalene continued to live in the Church's imagination, not on parchment, but in pigment stone and stained glass. The visual record of her across the centuries is both a mirror and a mask. It reflects the values of the age that created it, and it conceals the aspects of her story that age preferred to forget. In early Christian art, she appears sparingly often as part of a group of women at the tomb. She is identifiable only by context, a figure in a procession, rather than a solitary icon. But by the Middle Ages, the image shifts. She is shown alone, richly robed with a jar of ointment, the emblem drawn from Pope Gregory's conflation of her with the anonymous sinful woman. Here the visual Mary is no teacher of disciples, no recipient of visions, but the penitent weeping at the feet of Christ. An obscure but telling motif emerges in Renaissance depictions, the Magdalene in the wilderness, clothed in her own long hair, gazing heavenward in a posture of private devotion. This image, lush with drama and sensuality, became a favorite subject for painters from Titian to El Greco. It encapsulated the Church's preferred narrative, a woman redeemed from sin through repentance, while leaving no visual trace of her apostolic authority. The hands that once gestured in teaching are now clasped in prayer. The voice that once comforted the disciples is silenced. Yet there are moments, scattered and subtle, where older echoes break through. In some Eastern icons, she is shown standing before the apostles, her hand raised as if speaking. In others, she is depicted holding a red egg, a symbol from an Orthodox legend, in which she confronts the Roman emperor with the news of the resurrection. These images preserve a faint memory of the woman who spoke boldly in the garden and in her own gospel, even if they never fully restore her role. Thinking back to the confrontation with Peter in her text, the contrast is sharp. In art shaped by later tradition, Peter's authority is rarely in question. Mary's is rarely even depicted. The visual record does not simply omit her gospel, it redefines her entirely, offering a consistent iconography that leaves little room for the theological independence her text suggests. The scholarly debate around these images often circles the question of intentionality. Were artists consciously erasing her leadership, or were they simply working within the narrative framework they inherited? The answer may be less about individual choice and more about the deep grooves tradition had already carved. By the time a painter stood before a blank panel or canvas, the Magdalene as penitent was not a choice but an assumption, and yet even assumptions can be challenged. Modern artists have begun to reimagine her drawing on both canonical and non-canonical sources. Some place her side by side with Christ as an equal partner in ministry. Others restore the act of teaching to her hands. In these images, the tension between memory and myth is made visible, a reminder that art, like history, is never static, and that the woman in the fragments can still step forward if given space. When the fragments of the Gospel of Mary finally reached a wider audience in the late 20th century, they entered a world very different from the one that had quietly buried them. The modern reader, shaped by centuries of biblical interpretation, theological reform, and social change, approaches her words with questions that would have been alien to the earliest scribes, and with freedoms those scribes could not have imagined. In an age when access to texts is no longer limited by the speed of a copyist's hand, the Gospel's message travels far beyond the cloister and the academy. Translations circulate, online readings are shared in living rooms, study groups, and lecture halls. Its vision of a faith rooted in inner awakening rather than external control resonates in a culture wary of hierarchy, a culture where personal spirituality is often valued alongside or even above institutional religion. An obscure but telling measure of its modern appeal is how often it is embraced, not only by Christians, but by those outside the faith. The Gospel's focus on courage, self-knowledge, and the stripping away of fear lends itself to a broader spiritual conversation, one that can cross confessional boundaries. In this sense, Mary's voice has found an audience even more diverse than the one she might have known in her lifetime. Thinking back to her place in canonical scripture, the contrast is remarkable. The Mary of the Gospels is a figure defined by her relationship to Christ. The Mary of her own Gospel is also defined by her relationship to herself, her ability to receive, to interpret, and to speak. This dimension has made her a symbol for many modern readers of female authority in spiritual matters, a counterweight to centuries of patriarchal framing. The scholarly debate now often turns from questions of authenticity to questions of application. How should this text shape our understanding of early Christianity, and how should it shape our present? Some caution against reading modern values back into an ancient document, warning that to make Mary into a contemporary heroine is to risk losing the historical reality. Others argue that all sacred texts live in dialogue with the present, and that the rediscovery of her voice is itself an event that demands a response. You might imagine her words now appearing on the screen of a phone in a cafe, or read aloud in a small gathering under soft evening light. The setting is nothing like the dusty rooms or dim chapels of the past, yet the effect is much the same. A voice enters the air carrying both familiarity and disruption. It asks the listener not to cling to what is safe, but to trust what is true. And so, after centuries of silence, the Gospel of Mary is not simply a relic. It has become a living conversation, a text that challenges the boundaries of its own time and ours, and that continues to speak with fragments enough to those willing to hear. For all the pages recovered, all the scholarly debate, and all the modern enthusiasm, the Gospel of Mary remains a work defined as much by its silences as by its words. Those missing leaves, the long chasm in the middle of her vision, the lost opening that might have set the stage, are not simply empty spaces in a manuscript. They are absences that shape how we read what survives. When you encounter the first gap, the narrative drops away mid-thought like a breath cut short. You can guess at the contours of what is gone by tracing the edges, a sentence that begins with, "And then he said," but never reaches the words, a transition that hints at teaching now irretrievable. Scholars try to bridge these voids by comparing with other early Christian writings, finding thematic parallels in the Pistis Sophia, in certain passages of the Gospel of Thomas, in the Ascension of Isaiah. But parallels are not replacements. The best they can offer is a frame in which the missing picture might fit. An obscure but telling detail lies in the physical damage to the codex. The missing pages were not torn cleanly. They were lost to decay, the papyrus fibers fraying and breaking, until nothing remained but a faint outline of where the sheet had once been. This is not the mark of sudden censorship, or at least not one done with a blade. If suppression occurred, it worked through neglect, letting time and the elements do the work. Thinking back to the first discovery in the sands, you realize the gaps are part of the story's rhythm. The gospel came to us already in fragments, as if to remind us that history is never whole. We do not possess the past in its entirety. We inherit it in pieces, each one carrying both meaning and mystery. And perhaps that incompleteness is not only a frustration, but also an invitation. Some suggest that the gaps may even be a gift, forcing readers to engage more actively, to listen for what is implied, as much as what is stated. In this way, the Gospel of Mary mirrors her own teaching about inner knowing. The most important truths are not handed to you whole. They are assembled in the quiet of your own understanding. Still, the longing for the full text persists. You imagine what it would feel like to open a newly unearthed codex and see those absent lines, restored, the voice continuing where it once broke. Would it confirm what we have guessed? Would it overturn everything? Or would it speak of something so ordinary that all the centuries of speculation would seem excessive? For now, we live with the gaps, not as passive voids, but as spaces that shape the way we hear the fragments we have. And in those spaces, Mary's voice lingers unfinished, but unforgotten, waiting for the day when the missing lines might step out of silence into the light. If you gather the surviving fragments of the Gospel of Mary and lay them side by side, the Coptic leaves from the Berlin Codex, the Greek scraps from Oxyrhynchus, you begin to see more than just words. You see the outline of a voice, the cadence of thought, the rhythm of someone who speaks with both conviction and patience. The fragments are like islands in a sea of absence, but they are aligned closely enough that you can almost picture the bridges between them. Scholars have spent decades building those bridges in careful hypothetical arcs. They use parallel phrasing from other early Christian works, patterns of argument that match the surviving portions and the theological motifs already visible in her speech. It is a delicate craft part, linguistics part, history part, imagination, and every reconstruction is offered with the humility of knowing it could be wrong. The missing words could surprise us entirely. An obscure but telling feature of these reconstructions is how consistent Mary's tone remains, even when scholars disagree on the content. She emerges as calm in the face of doubt, grounded in her experience, unwilling to be rattled by opposition. Whether she is comforting frightened disciples or recounting her vision of the soul's ascent, her speech carries the same steady center. This is not the voice of a scribe copying doctrine. It is the voice of someone speaking from what she has seen. Thinking back to the layers of suppression and reinterpretation, you realize how much work it takes to hear that voice clearly. It means setting aside the image handed down by Pope Gregory's conflation. It means resisting the temptation to fit her neatly into modern ideals, even those meant to honor her. It means allowing the fragments to speak on their own terms without rushing to fill every silence. In this way, reconstructing Mary's voice is not just a scholarly exercise, it is an act of listening. The missing pages force us to slow down to dwell on each surviving phrase as though it were all we might ever have. That slowness has a way of changing the reader. The questions become less about proving a point and more about understanding the presence of a woman who once stood in a circle of men and spoke with an authority they did not expect. You might imagine placing the reconstructed gospel in the hands of its original hearers, asking them if we have understood her correctly. Would they nod, recognizing her in the phrases? Would they smile at our earnestness and say, "It was more than this, but this will do"? Or would they tell us that the gaps are not failures, but spaces meant for us to fill with our own seeking? And so with only pieces we begin to hear her again, not in the fullness she once had, but in a voice that still carries across centuries the sound of someone who knew what it was, to see beyond the veil and to speak of it without fear. The pages grow quiet now. You have followed Mary's voice through the dust and the centuries, through the cracks in parchment and the silences of councils, and you stand here at the edge of what can be known. The last leaf of the codex, like the final note of a song, does not end so much as it fades. It would be easy to close the book and call it incomplete, to see only the gaps and the questions that remain. Yet something in the surviving words resists that. Even in fragments, the gospel still carries a kind of wholeness, not in the sense of a finished story, but in the way a single seashell can still hold the sound of the sea. Her teaching, as far as we can hear it, is not bound to the year it was written. It asks for courage over fear, understanding over blind obedience, and the strength to speak what you have seen, even if others doubt you. These are not doctrines limited to one century or one faith. They are invitations anyone might answer. And so the voice returns, soft but steady, into a world very different from the one that buried it. The parchment is brittle, the ink faded, but the meaning is alive. If you lean close, you can still hear the cadence of her speech, the patience in her answers, the way she refuses to surrender what she knows to be true. The desert kept her secret for a long time. Now it is ours to keep, not locked away, but held carefully like something still breathing. You turn the last page not to end the story, but to carry it forward in the only way it can survive, by telling it again.